In 1842, a man in New York City opened a museum. Inside, a mummified mermaid, a woolly horse, a dog that could supposedly do arithmetic, a 160-year-old woman who had nursed George Washington as a baby. 10,000 people came through the doors every single day. Now, the mermaid was a monkey torso sewn to a fishtail, the woolly horse was a regular horse with a bad coat, the woman was elderly, but not 161, she was probably around 80. George Washington, he had been dead for 43 years. The arithmetic dog was, by all accounts, real, but that's not really the point. The point is, people knew, or at least they suspected, but they came anyway. P.T. Barnum didn't just build a career on lies. He built a career on something much more interesting than lies. And by the end of this video, they're going to understand why the movie they made about him, the one with Hugh Jackman, the one about inclusion and wonder, is itself a kind of con. I'm Johnny Diggs. Let's dig into this. Before the circus, before the museum, before the mermaid, there was the soap. I want to start here because this is the part of Barnum's story that got left out on the cutting room floor. And it tells you more about who he actually was than anything in the movie. Barnum grew up in Connecticut in a family that ran lotteries, which in the early 1800s were legal and extremely common. He learned early that people's desire to win something for nothing was essentially bottomless. His first real hustle as a young man was a variation on a classic street scheme. He'd sell bars of soap at public events. Inside some of the bars, he'd secretly placed currency, a dollar bill, sometimes more. He'd unwrap a few in public, let people see the cash, then he'd sell the remaining bars. The bars people bought, of course, contained nothing. But by then, Barnum had moved on to the next town. This is why old newspaper accounts from his rivals called him the Soap Man, and it wasn't a compliment. By the 1830s, Barnum had graduated to bigger operations. In 1835, he purchased a contract to exhibit an elderly enslaved black woman named Joyce Heth. He claimed she was 161 years old, born in 1674, and had been George Washington's nurse. He had documents to supposedly prove it. Of course, the documents were forged. He toured her across the entire Northeast, charging 25 cents a head. But when she died in 1836, he charged 50 cents admission to her public autopsy. The surgeon announced she was probably around 80 years old. Barnum told newspapers that the real Joyce Heth was still alive elsewhere, and that what they just autopsied was a different woman. He was still selling tickets to the story after the story was over. Fast forward to 1842. Barnum had opened his American Museum on Broadway. A 5-story building packed with oddities, performers, and exhibits that ranged from genuine curiosities to outright fabrications. The exhibit that defined his career came from a sea captain, and it is technically the most successful fraud in the history of marine biology. The Fiji mermaid was a taxidermied creation. The upper torso and head of a monkey sutured seamlessly to the tail of a large fish. It was objectively grotesque. It looked nothing like the flowing, beautiful mermaid in the advertising materials Barnum commissioned. Before the exhibit opened, Barnum planted letters in 3 different newspapers from 3 different cities, supposedly written by naturalists who had independently encountered this remarkable specimen. None of the naturalists even existed. He wrote all 3 letters himself. Then he sent illustrated pamphlets to every hotel in New York. Then he booked a British Dr. J. Griffin of the British Lyceum of Natural History to give a press conference presenting the mermaid. Dr. Griffin was Barnum's business partner in a wig. The exhibit ran for months. The lines, they never stopped. And here's the thing that Barnum understood, and that I think is the most important thing about this whole file. He never promised the mermaid was real. The ads asked a question. They didn't answer it. People came to decide for themselves, and the act of coming, the act of paying to look and make up their own mind, was the product Barnum was actually selling. Not a mermaid, but an experience of wondering. Now I have to tell you about the Cardiff Giant, because this is the story within the story that breaks my brain a little every time I come back to it. It is the only documented case I know of where a man successfully ran a con on a hoax. Now, before I get into that, if this is your first time on the channel, thank you so much for checking out the video. It would mean the whole world to our team if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us out an absolute ton. Every episode, I pull out a new file and take it apart until you understand not just what happened, but what made it possible. That's the whole show. So, in 1869, a man named George Hull buried a carved gypsum statue of a giant man on his cousin's farm in Cardiff, New York. A few months later, the cousin's workers discovered it while digging a well. Hull presented it as a petrified prehistoric giant. Crowds paid 50 cents to view it in a tent on the farm. It was a complete fake. Hull had commissioned the entire statue from a stone carver in Chicago. Now here's where Barnum comes in. He offered to buy it. Hull refused. So Barnum, he had his own replica carved. And then, and this is the part, he called Hull's original Cardiff Giant a fake. He told the press that his copy was the real one and that Hull's was an imitation of his. Hull's partner, David Hannum, was furious. He went to the press. He called Barnum a fraud. He called Barnum's audience gullible fools. He said, and this is the line that got misattributed to Barnum for the next 150 years, "There's a sucker born every minute." Hannum said it about Barnum's customers. The line has been attributed to Barnum, though, ever since. Think about what actually happened here. Hull faked a giant. Barnum faked Hull's fake giant. Hannum, the man who was being outconned by Barnum, said the famous line about suckers that everyone now thinks Barnum said. Barnum didn't just con people. He conned history itself. The man who never said, "There's a sucker born every minute," is the one who gets credit for saying it. And that might be the most Barnum thing about him. In 2017, a movie called The Greatest Showman came out. Hugh Jackman, Zac Efron, Zendaya. A very good soundtrack. It portrayed P.T. Barnum as a visionary champion of outsiders and misfits, a man who gave them the marginalized a stage when the world refused to see them. I need to be precise, though, about what the movie left out. Barnum's performers were not always there by choice. Many of the people he exhibited as curiosities, people with unusual physical characteristics, were paid very little, had no control over how they were presented, and were described in advertising with language that was explicitly dehumanizing. The film shows him defending his performers from a hostile crowd. The historical record shows him charging admission to see them framed as freaks, then pocketing most of the revenue. Tom Thumb, the performer perhaps most associated with Barnum, was signed by Barnum at age 4. 4 years old. The contract was with his parents. Charles Stratton had no say. None of this is in the film. And I want to be careful here because The Greatest Showman is a very entertaining movie that a lot of people love, even myself. I'm not here to ruin anything. But I will tell you this. The Greatest Showman is itself a Barnum-esque product. It sold you a feeling, wonder, inclusion, triumph, wrapped in just enough historical texture to feel real. It made you come in and decide for yourself. Barnum, well, he would have loved that. Every time I close a file, I ask the same exact question. Why did it work? Barnum is the hardest case we've covered to answer that question cleanly. Because unlike previous episodes with Lustig or Ponzi or McGregor, Barnum wasn't always lying. He was doing something more sophisticated than lying. Humbug. Barnum's own word for what he did. A humbug wasn't a lie. It was a performance, a theatrical event. He always left just enough ambiguity that you could choose to believe or not believe, and either way, you'd had an experience worth the ticket price. Wonder hunger. He understood that people don't just want to be entertained. They want to feel that the world is bigger and stranger than they thought. He sold that feeling at scale, and that hunger hasn't gone anywhere. But the third one is what I keep coming back to. Complicity. Barnum's greatest trick was making the audience a willing participant in the illusion. When you buy a ticket knowing it might be fake, but go in anyway, you've taken ownership of the experience. You're not a victim. You're a customer who got what they paid for. That's a harder thing to prosecute and a harder thing to resent. The con you chose to walk into isn't really a con at all, which is, now that I think about it, exactly what Barnum would want you to believe. Barnum